He will go on for 5 minutes talking about how Muslims can easily reinterpret verses and get away from the difficult meanings. That's not the case, because our interpretation of the Quran is very, very limited to the Prophet and his close companions. It is the Prophet and his close companions who took the Quran directly from the Prophet can interpret the Quran. We cannot interpret the Quran at will. We do not have that authority. Our theologians, our scholars, our ulama, our imams cannot do that. They do not have the authority to interpret the Quran at will. However, on the other hand, the Christian theologians, clergy, priests, and bishops have been doing it for centuries. For centuries, Christians have interpreted the Bible as they went along. Every time they faced a difficult question, they would interpret, reinterpret that reinterpretation, and reinterpret the reinterpretation of the reinterpretation. This is what the Christians have been doing for the past 2,000 years almost, right? So we cannot do that with the Quran. Thankfully, we have the Hadith tradition, we have the prophetic tradition that protects us against that approach. Because what happens, you get doctrines like the divinity of Jesus Christ. You get the doctrine of the Trinity, and you get other erroneous ideas imposed on the scripture by people who had no connection to the Jewish milieu of Jesus Christ.
So it's Christians are just interpreting, reinterpreting, then reinterpreting the interpretations, and that's how we get to the deity of Christ. Sam, is that the case, or have Christians believed in the deity of Christ since the first century, and we know that indisputably?
In fact, what's ironic, Dave, you know this very well, and I hope the Christians know this. The first heresy wasn't a denial of Jesus' deity. It was a denial of his humanity, because they all took for granted that Jesus was divine, that he was God. And you know what I'm talking about. Yep. The so-called Gnostics. But again, that term Gnostic is used by scholars for a variety of groups that believed that you had either a divine Christ manifesting in human form, Docetist, or you had a divine Christ and a human Jesus. So here's what's ironic, folks. Don't take my word for it. Again, any good book on church history by any qualified church historian, and this is a fact. What they were debating wasn't whether Jesus is God. They were debating whether he was truly human, and if so, how can someone who's God be human? Because the Greeks crept in and brought in their philosophical understanding of matter being evil, and that they wanted to be broken away from the material body and just be pure spirit. So if Jesus or Christ is divine, how could he inhabit a body of flesh, a material body, when that's corrupt and it's beneath someone that's fully divine? So it's ironic. The early heresies had to do with whether Jesus was truly human, not truly divine, truly God. It's ironic.
Yeah, and so it's just absolutely amazing that Adnan is talking about these reinterpretations of reinterpretations of reinterpretations, and that's how we get to our doctrines. Guys, the core doctrines of Christianity laid out: Jesus' death for sins, his resurrection, his divine nature. That's exactly what you find in our scriptures over and over and over again, like a beating drum. That's exactly what all Christians have believed. What he's referring to, and this is why this is so deceptive, right? As I said a little bit ago, what you do have is you have the Bible is 66 books, right? The Bible is 66 books. It's this massive compilation of texts, and you have you have tons of passages about the deity of the Father. You have passages about the deity of the Spirit. You have passages about the deity of the Son. You have all of these passages, and then you have all these passages about the incarnation. You did have a process among the Christian theologians and so on, and at the councils, where they would say, okay, how do we get all of that into something short? Because not everyone can read. Not everyone is even, in the early stages, not everyone had a copy of the Bible. Not everyone could read. How are we going to condense it so that Christians can know exactly what we believe? And so they would come up with nice formulations. But guess what? Someone would come along later and say, oh, your formulation doesn't include that, and so you need to fix it, or your formulation doesn't account for this. And so you do have them trying to work on how to summarize the doctrine, things like that. You do have that. And then lots of times what would happen was a heresy would arise, and they would have to make the formulation more explicit so that it's clear that the formulation is rejecting that heresy, right? Yes. So that's the process. But Adnan, he looks at that process and says, they're just revising the revisions and interpreting the... Dude, read the Bible.
Yeah.
death, deity, and resurrection all over the place. Right?
And David, I want to also highlight, because again, we have to hold him to a higher standard, because he's been debating Christians for years, and he's debated Samuel Green, yourself, James White, others. So he's not ignorant.
Yeah.
When he says Muslims, he speaks as if Islam is monolithic. There's only one version of Islam. But with that said,
absolute nonsense.
and here's what's sad. Forget the Shia Muslim. Forget the Quran only Muslim or the Ahmed. Forget them. Let's go within his own Sunni tradition. And he knows this because he claims to be a Salafi. Not only historically, but even now, you have a debate among those who are Sunni Muslims who would either subscribe to the Ash'ari Creed or the Maturidi Creed or the Athari Creed on the exact nature of Allah. Does Allah have hands? Or is that metaphorical language? Does Allah have an actual shin? Or is that metaphorical language? Does Allah have a waist? Or is that metaphorical language? And if he has hands, does he have a right hand, a left hand, or two right hands? And when he created Adam, did he create Adam in his own shape of 60 cubits? Or is that metaphorical? And on it goes. And not just with Allah. They can't even decide what Muhammad and his companions meant when they said Allah rises above the throne. Allah has hands. Allah has eyes. Allah has a shin. Some say these are actual characteristics of Allah. These are actual body parts, even though they won't call it body parts, but it's unlike anything in creation. Others who subscribe to the Athari Creed or the Maturidi Creed, like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, would say, no, that's metaphorical. When it says the hand of Allah, that's a metaphor for the power of Allah, the strength of Allah. Eyes of Allah, that's metaphorical because Allah doesn't have eyes. So you guys can't even figure out what Muhammad and his companions meant when they described Allah in this anthropomorphic language. But then another point, and I know I'm speaking fast because I'm trying to get as much in because we want to get to all the clips. Another point, Adnan knows that early in Islamic history, there was a battle and a debate over the nature of the Quran. You had the Mu'tazilites, Mu'tazili, versus the quote-unquote, using Bart Ehrman's term, which he loves to parrot, the proto-Orthodox Sunni group on whether the Quran is created or uncreated. You had a Mu'tazilite caliph named Ma'mun, and I believe it was in the 800s, who imprisoned and beat any Muslim who would say the Quran is uncreated. He even had Ahmad ibn Hanbal, if my memory serves correct, by the grace of God, thrown in jail and beaten because he refused. Ahmad ibn Hanbal refused to say the Quran is created. And you're telling me that you Muslims are agreed on the nature of Allah and his characteristics? Now that's either a bold-faced lie and he knows it, or he's ignorant about Islam. And if he's ignorant about Islam, he disqualified himself for speaking on these matters.